Hey there. So, I'm having a small dilemma about what to grow, or maybe I should say let grow, in some garden beds, and I thought I would try debating it with myself in a small video. So let's go have a look. So here's the dilemma. Growing in this bed I have some radicchio, a kind of chicory, and I have high hopes for trying to get it through the winter, at least part of the winter, perhaps under some cold frames. And you might notice that it's relatively weed-free in this bed, but there is one other kind of plant that is growing here, at least for now. And this is hairy bittercress. Now, hairy bittercress is edible, and it tastes pretty nice. It has a taste somewhat similar to watercress, for instance, and it's a member of the brassica family. And it produces prolific amounts of seed, at least when you have many plants growing in a bed. And the seed pods look very similar to those of, for instance, kale or other brassicas, like these here. And these seed pods are highly explosive. So it could be regarded as a serious weed. It's an annual, and I find it relatively easy to remove from beds, and I don't really find it being a source of serious problems for cultivating in these beds. Hairy bittercress is a native plant here in Europe and in Denmark, and by many gardeners it may be considered a nuisance. It can be found even in potted plants that you might buy in a nursery or a garden center, and it's really very common growing up between bricks in a terrace, just about everywhere that it can spread a few seeds and take hold. If this were the United States, I would be much more worried about allowing a non-native plant to have some space in a garden bed. But since it is native here in Europe and may actually serve some ecological function, I'm not really certain whether it's a good thing or a bad thing to completely remove it. To put things in perspective, running along this raised bed is a living pathway, which is essentially grass and some other plants. And I'm actually much more concerned about those plants moving into the raised bed than I am about the hairy bittercress. And I don't just mean things like this little strawberry, which is creeping over from a neighboring bed, but for instance, ground elder, which once it becomes established in a bed is very difficult to eradicate again. Since hairy bittercress is an annual, or perhaps a biennial, problems with it don't really come from the perennial persistence of roots in the soil as much as from perhaps copious amounts of seeds that may be produced by the plant. This might be similar to some of the problems with mustard garlic, particularly in North America, where the plant is an invasive weed. Also, mustard garlic is allelopathic. That means it releases substances into the soil to fight against other plants. And I'm not very knowledgeable about hairy bittercress and whether it also has these capabilities, which may be a problem, for instance, for the radicchio. As I mentioned, the seeds are contained in pods that resemble those of other brassicas, perhaps just in miniature. The Danish common name for hairy bittercress is springklap, which basically describes the way that mature pods explode and seeds, we could say, spring forth from these pods. So hairy bittercress is not the only species in its genus, and maybe we can go have a quick look at one of its close relatives, which I am growing intentionally. So beside this little variegated clover that I recently found and dug up and stuck in a pot just to see what would happen with it is this relative of hairy bittercress, the cuckoo flower, or sometimes called mayflower. Now, I'm quite certain that that's what this is because I'm cultivating it intentionally and I've seen it flowering. And the flowers of cuckoo flower are actually quite different from those of hairy bittercress. They're much larger. They tend to be a little bit more pink. And as I said, I've seen it flower. So unless the hairy bittercress in the course of the summer has invaded this pod and replaced the cuckoo flower, I'm quite certain that that's what we have here. Cuckoo flower typically grows in wet habitats, and it's an important food source for many insects, including orange-tip butterflies. This consideration of whether hairy bittercress is an important food source for some insects and other organisms is one I take really seriously. For instance, it may actually be a food source for whitefly, which are at least a cosmetic nuisance on larger brassicas like kale. And since the species of whitefly that affect brassica are largely an aesthetic problem on plants like kale, and kale overwinters itself, I'm not really sure whether worrying about the whitefly on any small hairy bittercress is something I should give that much concern to. But since I'm not familiar with all the different insects that may be able to overwinter in hairy bittercress and affect other brassicas than kale, for instance, then I'm slightly wary about giving these insects an opportunity. For instance, I don't even know what is on the back of this leaf of the bittercress here. Are these eggs, cocoons, or possibly some kind of fungal infection? Under a hand lens, I haven't been able to figure this out yet. So I just don't know enough about the role of hairy bittercress in this garden ecosystem. One of the only things I do know is that it's one of the few plants that's available in late winter and early spring when things are just getting going again for many insects and other organisms after the winter. So that's just the thing. Hairy bittercress fills a particular niche, but what's the risk of just leaving it here? So one possibility is just to keep a sharp eye out for when the hairy bittercress is flowering and remove any flowers or at least any immature seed pods. But the real question for me is whether I need to be so vigilant or whether I can just let the hairy bittercress do its thing here and then remove it once I need to establish something else in this bed. That's basically the question I'm asking myself here in October. The reason I'm asking this question now is because in autumn I typically am putting a lot of beds to sleep, at least the ones where there's nothing growing in them for a fall harvest. And whereas this bed is still in production, so to speak, with this radicchio, I would typically mulch around it. And the question is whether I should do that. And that would include then first removing the hairy bittercress and then trying to smother out any new plants, since hairy bittercress is very, very cold hardy, or whether I just want to leave it here as a kind of winter crop, at least in some controlled area. In the middle of winter, we may find ourselves with not very much lettuce or arugula in the greenhouse, and we may be glad that we have a little bit of these greens for a salad bowl. And particularly in the hunger gap, that is in late winter and early spring, it may be that very little is available except for kale. So do I want to allow myself that foraging opportunity? And that just means being a little bit forward-thinking and weighing up the risks and the benefits. Okay, so what am I going to do? I hate to disappoint anybody, but I really haven't decided. I think for now the hairy bittercress is going to stay, but it's just as likely that in the near future I'm going to remove it and mulch around the radicchio. I'm not sure yet. Anyway, thanks for participating in my little debate, and if you have any feedback, suggestions, etc., please feel free to leave these in the comments. Bye for now.